Alright, welcome back. Sorry for the long delay between videos. Life gets in the way and other projects have been coming up. But the CO2 experiment did end, and I think I have enough of a result here to make a suggestion about which methodology I would prefer. And it's not really down to one product or one system or the other. It's under the circumstances. So we'll start with the pressurized system first. So with the pressurized system, you basically have to fill up the canisters inside of the aquarium every day, and it's simple. You just turn a little knob and they fill up. But this is a daily thing, and I had the lights on a timer, which I eventually took them off of, so that I would have to manually turn them on. I would already be at the tanks, I would see the system, I would fill it up with CO2. So if you're by the tanks every day, that's a good thing, but other issues are mainly chemical. As everybody understands, you deal with CO2, you're dealing with carbonic acid, and that can lead to various issues with KH, GH, and pH, which I love this saying. It's all over the internet. It's the Bermuda Triangle of the aquarium hobby. Now, because of some mix-ups that I described in a previous video, we did experience some leaf melt with the Storagine Rapins, which was surprising. I was kind of expecting it out of the Cryptoquarium Winty. Just because when you pull that stuff out of one tank, put it into another, it seems to suffer. You have to cut the roots back. You want it to grow again, and usually you experience leaf melt on that plant, but we really didn't have that problem in this case. Now, both of these systems were under the same light, which really wasn't the most ideal setup, considering that the plants use the liquid CO2 at a certain rate and absorb the pressurized CO2 at a certain rate, and you have to account that photosynthesis only happens when the lights are on, and then it respires when the lights are off. So if we repeat this experiment, I'll probably put them under different lights and kind of dial them in. That was a problem, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The other big issue with the CO2 tank, and I don't know if this was just unique to the CO2, was brown diatom algae, which takes a little bit to get rid of. It's more involved than the green algae that I kept having in the liquid CO2 tank, and it was more of a pest. Now, the pressurized system, there's a small cylinder that goes inside the aquarium, and if algae gets in there, it's really hard to clean. I use toothbrushes and toothpicks and everything like that, and it still looks grimy and dirty, and I'm going to figure out a way to make it look like new again before I add it into another tank. But if you like that very pristine look, or if you can't hide this little canister, and it's kind of, for a 10-gallon aquarium, it's pretty obvious. It's not like you can just hide this piece of equipment unless you have a densely planted tank. So that was another thing that I wasn't too fond of, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it. As you can probably guess, the liquid CO2 tank was a lot easier to manage. It's just a once-a-week thing. You dose the tank and you don't really have to come back and deal with it. However, it did give rise to green diatom algae. Now, the difference between the pressurized tank and the liquid tank had to do with how big the plants were, how full the leaves were they reaching towards the light, and in both cases, yeah, the leaves were pretty full, they were reaching toward the light, but there was an obvious increase in growth in the CO2 tank. It wasn't by a ton, but if you're looking to speed up, and this experiment went on for 3 months, so if I left it up for 6, I might have seen a much more dramatic difference between the liquid CO2 and the pressurized CO2 tanks. Now, where the pressurized system had the brown algae, the CO2 system, the liquid CO2 system, had green algae, which I'm a little bit more familiar with. I'm used to combating it. It wasn't that big of an issue. But I was kind of stunned by the difference, considering they were over the same light. And so the different methodologies actually gave rise to different algae, whether it was liquid CO2, which, as I understand, is glutaraldehyde, and it's just a sterilant. It's not that different from aldehyde. And then the pressurized system giving rise to that brown algae. I don't have a real good explanation for that. I imagine it's the way that it's synthesized, and how the plants and the algae use it, and what might remain in the tank. Again, you're dosing once a week with a liquid tank, pressurized. You have to come over there and turn that thing on every day. So I don't know if there was more of a concentration, or if my timing was right. I wasn't waiting long enough after the lights were on, the plants were absorbing enough of it, or if the change in KH and GH was causing that issue. Now when I pulled the plants out, both tanks, the plants in both tanks, had a really good, healthy looking root structure. Obviously, both of these plants grew. If you go back and watch a previous video and then watch this one, you can tell the difference, and you could see it in the root system. The pressurized system definitely had a little bit more to its roots when I did a side-by-side comparison, and I'm sorry I didn't get a picture of that. That was a complete waste of an opportunity. But I would say it was either a quarter or a third longer in length. So these plants in the CO2 system were definitely reaching out, which I think would probably be great for propagation, and I probably could have done that if I had thought about it at the time. As you know, the Temple Compacta that I added in weeks after I started this experiment, in both tanks blew up. Leaves were huge, healthy, green, very vibrant, and the root structures on both of them, I did not have this plant the right substrate. The roots were very visible above the substrate that I was using, so maybe a slightly smaller substrate to begin with would have been better. But the plants themselves did fine, and I was actually surprised at how rapidly they grew. I did have to adjust the lighting period a few times actually. Like I said, it was on a timer, and then I took it off the timer so I could play with it manually and try and get that dialed in. Having one light, like I said, over both systems was probably not a wise idea. If I had to guess, I would say I would have needed a longer lighting period for the CO2 system, or I'm sorry, the pressurized CO2 system, or on the pressurized CO2 system I was adding too much CO2. Instead of what I was typically doing was filling up 1.5 of those canisters, I probably should have just been doing 1. But hindsight is always 20/20. Liquid CO2 was much easier to maintain, and I kind of went off of what was happening in that tank more than I did with the pressurized CO2, which might be half the reason why this led to problems with KH, GH, and pH, on top of my not understanding what my well water was doing at this time. Again, you can go back through the videos and actually explain what happened there. So, in summary, I would use the pressurized CO2 system on a slightly larger tank that was densely planted. Just trying to get all that CO2 taken care of before the lights go out. That way I don't have huge fluctuations in pH overnight, and it's not just tearing away at my KH levels. I was surprised how rapidly those just dropped and plummeted. The liquid CO2, I would say, is easier on a smaller tank, easier to manage, and plus it doesn't mess with the chemistry, and usually in smaller tanks your chemistry can start changing really fast. So the next few setups that I'll do, I'll continue using liquid CO2. I had plans for this pressurized CO2. I'm kind of thinking of putting it in my Tetra tank with a lot of dwarf hairgrass in there. I've been wanting a carpeted tank for a long time. Sorry, I don't have a script in front of me, so I'm having to think of this as I go. So that's kind of my preferred usage. Dosing is not a huge issue once you get into the routine, but it does take a little bit to get into the routine, and if you start skipping beats, one day you're adding CO2, the next one you're not on the pressurized system, then yeah, I can see how that leads to problems, and it kind of mismanages the water chemistry. I really, especially in the beginning, I had to test both tanks over and over and over to see what was happening with the chemistry, especially once the Storegine Rapids started experiencing leaf melt. That was pretty alarming. I would say if you're looking at getting into the pressurized CO2 system, I don't want to talk you out of it, but I would definitely say start off on a small tank you don't care about. Maybe you have a handful of plants that are just sitting around in a tank somewhere. I would say start on those and go as lightly as possible. I would say underestimate the amount of CO2 out of the pressurized system you should use, and do it maybe 30 minutes after the lights come on, maybe an hour. Again, I didn't really get that nailed down before the experiment ended. I needed that space in the room, so and then kind of work your way up from there. Go ahead and load up on those test strips. I burned through 2 packs of them in probably 2 weeks, and keep on hand plenty of chemical solutions that will jump up the KH and the pH of your aquarium after, like I said, I'm using well water, but if you're using tap water, that the chemicals that neutralize all the harmful substances in the tap water can affect the pH and the pH. I've seen that before. So I definitely want to do this experiment again at a later date. Again, I'll probably try a little bit less CO2. I'll probably have the systems on different lighting and keep a log of when I turn on the lights and when I don't, when I turn them off. I'll keep better records of my dosing. Like I said, for a while there, kind of had an emergency. I wasn't worried so much about writing everything down as I was keeping the chemistry right and not just destroying these plants. I don't know what we have planned next for experiments, but if you have ideas or thoughts or something you want us to look into, leave us a comment, leave us a like. You can find us at thenatureaquarium.com, thenatureaquarium.com. Hopefully here soon, when I have a few more hours, I can sit down and do a write-up on how this experiment ended. Although this video is probably a pretty good record to go by.